Our team currently consists of 2 officers and a sergeant. And then we have 3 detectives and the detective sergeant who work separate on the more felony compelling charges. We're more focused on the misdemeanor prostitution and promoting prostitution charges. We are also part of the federal task force with the FBI, and we're deputized as special marshals so that we can make arrests in Washington and out of state.
What prompted the creation of this group? Was it like a spike in the human trafficking, or was it just, we need to stop this now?
Yeah, so there's always been detectives that dealt with the bigger cases. Our team got started about 7 years ago, and it was actually a response to neighborhood complaints around 82nd Avenue of the prostitution activity that was going on. And the neighbors were getting very frustrated with, condoms and needles in their yards where their kids play, and the crime that was associated with the prostitution, fights and assaults and other kinds of things that were going on outside their houses. And so they were very upset and discussed it with the police. And so they started our team, which initially was basically to get the women off the street. That was the idea in the beginning, right? To get everybody off the street. Got started about 7 years ago, and it was actually a response to neighborhood complaints around 82nd Avenue of the prostitution activity that was going on. And the neighbors were getting very frustrated with, condoms and needles in their yards where their kids play, and the crime that was associated with the prostitution, fights and assaults and other kinds of things that were going on outside their houses. And so they were very upset and discussed it with the police. And so they started our team, which initially was basically to get the women off the street. That was the idea in the beginning, right? To get everybody off the street. So they did that for a while and cleaned it up a little bit, but then they realized that it wasn't really changing anything, because the women would be back out on the street before you could even get your reports written, right?
Oh, wow.
So they realized that they needed to take a little bit of a different focus and try and focus on the causes, not just that the women were out there, but why they were out there, and try and stop it from the beginning. So
what do you see as the main causes in our local area for human trafficking, and do you see that as different from the global scale of human trafficking?
Yeah, I mean, human trafficking itself is a much bigger issue because it includes labor trafficking. We deal only with sex trafficking, which is, So sex trafficking, I mean, I'd say that the main reason that people are out there is because they are coerced or manipulated into doing it by another person. And then as you go along in their life, there's generally, whether or not they have a trafficker, if they stay in the life, it's generally because they don't feel like they have any other options, or they're addicted to drugs or something like that.
Oh, wow.
But especially in the younger females, it's almost always a trafficker. Most of them are not addicted to drugs when they start. They become addicted to drugs because they're covering up the pain of what they're doing. So then we became part of a team of cities. There's 11 cities that got together. I don't know if I'd be able to name all of them, but we signed agreements. It's called the CEASE Network, CEASE, CEASE. And it's basically a group that tries to focus on demand reduction, which basically means going after the buyer.
Yeah.
So we look at it as an economics issue. So demand drives supply, right? So if you have no demand, then there wouldn't be these girls getting put out on the street, right? So, so we've started shifting our focus that way, and focus more on arresting the buyers and educating them on what they're doing. And as well, and the other track is going after the traffickers, because they're, generally the real villain in this. So, and then along those same lines, trying to get the girls into services.
Yeah.
And trying to get them to just get their life turned around and keep them safe. So that's the new focus. The task force as a whole is just kind of created so that everyone can work together. Otherwise, you have every agency working by themselves kind of becomes chaotic. So
yeah.
Yes.
Where do you see most cases from? Is there a central hub for it? Like Clackamas Town Center, we've learned is a really big one, in Lloyd Center, but...
Yeah, are you talking about recruiting?
Yeah.
Or are you talking about actual prostitution? Recruiting?
Yeah.
I would say, we like to say that it's everywhere. Malls are big. We say anywhere that young girls hang out. That's where it's going to be. But we're also seeing it in the schools, recruiting. And, they'll pay students to recruit other students. And the biggest issue we're facing at this point is social media.
Yeah, how has that changed the accessibility to human trafficking, both for buyers and victims?
Well, for buyers, it's definitely made it a lot easier, a lot more anonymous. You don't have to go drive around the street. They maybe feel safer. You're not going up and down 82nd Avenue, and maybe the cops will see you and stop you. And for the traffickers, it's made it a lot easier because it's less, I guess it seems less low class if you're not walking the street, right? So you're in a nice hotel room, and you have, it's easier to get girls to do that than it is to maybe just walk up and down a street, right, where they might be noticed.
Yeah.
So it's definitely more anonymous. But on the recruiting side, we're seeing it's a huge issue because a lot of the girls that we're seeing now are getting recruited through Facebook. And they're getting through dating sites is a big one now.
Oh,
so
wow.
all the normal dating sites, where legitimate people are using them for dating, traffickers are putting themselves on there. And then when they're contacting females and manipulating and tricking them into relationships with them, and then eventually forcing them into working the street. So that's what we're seeing a lot, is they're using social media and dating websites, also like Kik and other chatting apps are difficult because they're more anonymous and more difficult to track. And when we download phones and such, it's more difficult to get the information from those kinds of applications. So yeah, social media has had a huge impact on it, I think, and the websites also, Backpage and DNA Board and the other websites have increased it only because they've increased the accessibility for the average person, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How has that changed how you intercept the traffickers? So if you find that they're doing it over social media, would you somehow track them over social media and then go, or just go and arrest them?
Yeah. So there's multiple ways. We put up fake escort ads on Backpage, and we have undercover decoy phones that the buyers will contact, and we will make deals with them over the phone, and then we will agree to meet them at a specific location. And after making the deal, because the crime of prostitution, all you have to do is agree to make an agreement to exchange a sex act for something of value.
Yeah.
And then so once they make the agreement, and then you have to show that they had intention, right, to actually go through with it. So once they've shown up at our location, that's enough probable cause that they intended to actually go through with the agreement they've already made. So then we arrest them at that point. So we've been using the social media and websites to our advantage in some way. It makes it more difficult because it's so much bigger. But in some ways, it helps us too, because it is more anonymous, and it's easier for us to be like a pretend person, right?
Yeah.
In addition, we have, a lot of fake social media accounts, and we are sometimes contacted by pimps who are trying to recruit us, and we will, talk to them for long periods of time, and sometimes get them to fly in from out of state and then arrest them at the airport.
Oh, wow.
So there's a lot of different ways that we're trying to use social media, but of course, we're a lot older, so some of it is, I grew up in, AOL was like when I was in high school, right? So I know a lot about general social media, but the apps and stuff, they change so much, and so we have to rely a lot on our victims actually to help us, to teach us about the new ways that they're doing it, because every day it seems like they're using a new website or a new app in creative ways.
Yeah.
So we're learning a lot about technology in the process.
Do you ever see that the victims are incarcerated and punished as well for prostitution, rather than giving a support network once they're saved, or is it usually just they arrest the trafficker and help the victim?
I would say it depends. If they're a minor, they're not going to go to jail. If we catch an adult victim, what we do is they're given a citation, which means they're technically charged with a crime, but we don't take them to jail. When they come to court, they're given the option that they can take services, and if they complete a program with a group called LifeWorks Northwest, who has a specific program, the New Options for Women program, which is focused on helping women involved in prostitution and sex trafficking. If they go to, counseling, they get drug and alcohol therapy if they need that, they get mental health therapy if they need that. And if they complete this program, then the charge is erased from their record.
Oh.
So that's the basic strategy we have. So that technically they are charged with a crime because they have committed one, but they're given an option to do something positive that will help them, erase it from their record so that it doesn't follow them forever.
That's really nice.
If it's a juvenile, they're not going to go to jail. They're automatically 100% a victim. We don't think that, children can't make choices like that. So, and if they're a juvenile, we also know we're almost always 100% positive they have a track record. So, because, 15-year-old girls just don't decide to become prostitutes one day.
Yeah.
So, those cases, if it's a juvenile, the detectives take it and they're going to focus really hard on trying to get those girls out of the life and get them somewhere safe, and then trying to prosecute whoever is trafficking them. We do have cases where women who are victims can also become traffickers. So you'll have something called a bottom, and she's going to be like the highest level of the girl in one trafficker's group. And the bottom will control the other girls, collect money, teach them the ropes, etc. when the trafficker isn't there.
Why would they want to do that if they've already gone through the same thing that the girls are going through?
So they may not want to do it, but they may feel like they don't have another choice. A lot of them face physical violence when they don't do what their trafficker wants. In the same sense, there's a lot of, this gets complicated. I'll explain as much as you want. It gets kind of lengthy, but, so basically traffickers and victims often, victims have, the traffickers don't care about anybody but themselves, but they develop what's called a trauma bond, or it's sometimes called Stockholm Syndrome.
Yeah.
So most people have heard of Stockholm Syndrome. We call it a trauma bond. It's very similar. It's very similar to like a domestic violence situation. So the majority of these women are in love with their traffickers and think that they're their boyfriend.
No.
So that's how they get them. That's how they recruit them, is that they'll pretend to be their boyfriend. So they get them into a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, and then they'll manipulate them into this life. And the girls still think that they're in a relationship, right? And that they're doing this to better them as a couple. That's not always true. There are gorilla pimps, as we call them, who are just violent and just like outright force the girls through physical violence to do these things. But they're actually more rare than people think. Most of them are what we call the finesse pimp, right? And they're the guys who can talk anybody into anything, right? You know, they're going to sell Eskimo ice. So they are generally narcissists. They're aggressive narcissists, pathologically narcissistic, and they'll do anything and hurt anybody to get what they want. And that's their basic philosophy. So they convince these girls that they're in a relationship with them. They manipulate them into working as a prostitute. So the girls are in love with them, and they feel loyalty to them, even if they don't know. And a lot of these girls don't know any better because their whole life they've been abused. So they don't really understand what a good relationship is.
Yeah.
And then you have other girls coming into the picture, and all these girls think that they're this guy's girlfriend, which creates a competition between the girls, right? So they play the girls off each other. They have them compete with each other. Whoever makes the most money is the favorite, is going to get favoritism. And the bottom, you know, she's the highest, right? So she may feel more important, that she's special, right? That she's the highest of the girls, right? Like she's his real girlfriend or wifey or whatever they call it.
Yeah.
And the other girls aren't as important, which may, you know, get her to do things that normally you would say, why would I, you know, get a 13-year-old girl into something that I just, you know, was traumatized by my whole childhood.
Yeah.
And now I'm getting, they don't think of it like that. They've normalized that trauma in their head. And they also, you'll see this sometimes. I don't know if you've ever heard of, like, they had a case where these 3 girls were kidnapped by this guy and kept in a basement, and they started competing with each other, and one would do things to the other girls because if she did it, he wouldn't hurt her.
Oh my gosh.
Right. So that's not necessarily what's happening, but it's more psychological in that if these girls do it, she doesn't have to do it anymore. Right? And they're not trying to be malicious, but you know, it's some kind of relief that if there's more girls, then I don't have to do it as much. And he won't focus all his anger at me. Right?
Yeah. So
they don't have to turn in any tricks. They may not get beat up as much. You know, maybe they get extra drugs or extra affection if they do these things. So a lot of it is really a psychological trauma issue, which makes it very difficult for us because when we find these girls, we want to help them, and they don't think they're victims, right? They think they're somebody's girlfriend.
Yeah.
So, and they're in love, and they're going to get married. And it's very difficult to convince them that their trafficker does not actually care about them, right? Yeah.
Is it hard to keep them off the streets and, like, away from their trafficker? Are there very special measures that need to be taken to ensure their safety, or is it up to them sometimes?
It's very difficult because, like I said, they don't think they're victims, they're in love, but in some instances also they're ashamed to go back to their family, or honestly, in some of the cases, their family is worse, right? I mean, they left their home life because it was worse than what they're doing now. So,
can you grab my backpack, Nicole?
Also, a lot of traffickers have gang ties, and so the girls are very afraid of their friends. So they'll tell them, you know, if you run away, my friends are going to come get you. They're going to hunt you down, or we know where your family lives, or they'll threaten, well, if you leave, we're just going to go get your little sister and turn her out. So a lot of the girls will stay because they don't want anything bad to happen to their family. And also, a lot of these, as they get older, a lot of these women will have children with their trafficker. And so their trafficker is the legal parent of their child. And so they could take them. And legally, they are allowed to do that.
Oh, my God.
So the girls they have a lot of fear But they also have this, like, this idea of loyalty kind of in there, beaten into them, you know, maybe physically, maybe not, but so that, you know, we have girls who've been in the life for almost 20 years, and they have had horrible, horrible things happen to them, and they don't want to do it anymore, and they want out, but they just can't bring themselves to tell on their pimp.
Oh my
because
gosh.
they want out of the life, but they're not going to snitch because that's not loyal.
Yeah.
They're not being loyal to the family. So, so it's very difficult to get them away. They often, even when we can find them a protected environment to be in, they'll often run away back to their trafficker. And a lot of the time it's a problem because we actually don't have anywhere to put them. There's very, very few safe houses for these women, and almost none of them are secure in the sense that they can't leave. So, you know, it becomes very difficult because obviously we see them as victims, but we also know that the majority of them, if given the chance, are going to leave their safe house eventually. And so, especially a juvenile who isn't allowed to make those kinds of decisions, would be, we want to put them somewhere where we know they're safe and they can't leave, but at the same time, they're victims. So, you know, you're not going to put them in jail, right? Which would be a safe-ish place. Maybe not jail, but, you know, juvie.
Yeah.
But they're a victim, so you don't want to incarcerate them. You're not trying to punish them. But we want to put them somewhere we know they're safe, and the only way to do that is to basically incarcerate them, which we actually can't do. So it's very difficult because there's almost no safe houses and actual places to put them. And the places that aren't really secure. I mean, they can just leave. So we try our best, but a lot of the time we find that the best measures we have is to actually send them to treatment programs out of state, because then they're far away from their trafficker and they're not going to go get them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're looking at is whether government and the private sector should be involved in combating and caring for combating trafficking and caring for the victims. So what do you think is the best mixture of that?
So when you say private sector, do you mean
private charities?
Like charities, okay. Yes, we think that's great, and that actually is, we work a lot with private nonprofits. We have several faith-based organizations as well who help us, who have programs for the girls, who will provide them with mentors or a place to drop, like a drop-in place for the day, or give them clothes or toiletries or whatever they need it. And those nonprofits are very helpful to us, because if we find a victim and, well, all she needs to stay off the street that day is some food, then, you know, they provide us with gift cards and stuff like that we can give the girls. Also, if the girls need, like, a stroller for their kid, we have people who will get us a stroller. So it's a great partnership because they have resources that we don't have. You know, their group has money that we don't have as a government organization. And they, you know, they'll help us if we have, okay, the safe house in Phoenix will take this girl, we need money for a plane ticket, and they'll come through for us on that. So we definitely work with a lot of nonprofits. LifeWorks itself is a nonprofit organization, and they have, you know, clinical specialists, but they also have survivors who work there, who will help the girls find housing and get on medical and get their kids back and all kinds of stuff like that. So it's definitely an important partnership, the government agencies and the nonprofits, because we just don't have the resources to help them in a lot of the ways they need help.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we're not treatment specialists. We don't have safe houses, you know, so those are all run by charities and nonprofits.
is one of the main ways that the victims get like convinced that their pimp isn't in love with them by talking to survivors?
Yes, I think that helps a lot. I mean, we'll talk to them and we try and tell them stuff, and they're like, whatever. You don't know what you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We don't know anything about it. And I think it is important for them to meet other survivors and talk to them in that way, but I also think in the way that a lot of these girls think they have no worth, right? And they can't do anything else. And the survivors show them that they can have a future, a different future. So I think that's important also. But I think a lot of the times the girls just have to get distant. You know, once they get away from their trafficker, they talk to some survivors. They go to some therapy groups with other survivors. You know, they start to realize that wasn't a healthy relationship, right?
Yeah. When making arrests of the human traffickers and the buyers, what are some contributing factors as to how long one is imprisoned or what the punishment they receive is?
Okay. So we actually have pretty good laws here in Oregon now. Our traffickers are getting long sentences. We had a guy get life.
Good.
You know, we're getting they're pretty standardly getting 10 to 30 years. Especially, so some of the things that are going to affect that is going to be if they're trafficking juveniles, their sentence is going to be way higher. If they're trafficking through violence, it'll be higher. So there's a difference there's two different laws. There's promoting prostitution is one crime, which means that you receive or agree to receive profit from the act of prostitution. And then there's compelling prostitution, which basically means you force or coerce somebody into doing that. If you are trafficking a juvenile, you're automatically compelling because juveniles can't consent, right?
Yeah.
So anyone trafficking a juvenile is going to be charged as compelling, which is a much higher crime. If you're the people who are like, this is my boyfriend and I work for him and I give him the money, but basically if we can ask the question, if you don't do it, are you afraid of what he'll do? If the answer is no, then all we can really get them on is promoting. So they're basically aiding and assisting a prostitution act, or they're receiving something from the prostitution act. Promoting is still a felony, but it's a C felony as opposed to an A felony. So the time is going to be a little bit less. If they have no record, that could influence it. How many times, we can start, if it's a one-time promoting, or if we can prove 50 prostitution acts get promoted, then they compound upon each other. But the cases are very difficult to prosecute. A lot of them are victim-driven, and if we lose our victims, then we're kind of halfway out of luck. I mean, we try and corroborate a lot of it through phone evidence and motel receipts and video and all that kind of thing. But if our victim won't testify, it becomes very difficult.
Yeah. Okay. I don't really know if I have any other questions. Do you have questions?
There was one about the social media stuff and how social media makes it a lot easier for traffickers to recruit and to sell to people, but it also makes it easier for you to catch them. Would it be better if social media wasn't a factor because it'd make it more difficult for them to traffic, but it would also make it more difficult for you to catch them? What would be the best situation for that?
Well, you're right. I mean, it would be more difficult. The industry may not be so big, but it would make it more difficult to catch them for us. So it's I guess it would kind of be a wash. But we'd just be going back to the old days where we're just kind of driving up and down 82nd Avenue trying to catch them on the street. So I don't think it would go away. The industry, I don't think, would go away. Especially here in Oregon, our sex industry is tied very strongly to our strip clubs Oregon has more strip clubs, or Portland, sorry, not even Oregon. Portland has more strip clubs than Las Vegas.
Oh my. Wow.
And we're also one of the very, very, very few places in the entire country, including Las Vegas, where you can be fully nude. So even in Las Vegas, you can't be fully nude. Seattle has 5 strip clubs. Portland has a couple hundred. So, and the Oregon Supreme Court ruled that exotic dancing is a form of expression, therefore it is protected under the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and that's why it cannot be regulated here. So we can't tell people how many strip clubs there can be.
Huh.
Yeah, I know. So our sex industry our trafficking industry is very tightly tied to our strip clubs. A lot of the traffickers will work their girls out of the strip club, which they know is safer for them because the police can't really get in there and do anything because we're not allowed to receive lap dances or anything like that. So also in between dates, they'll have them work as dancers to make money and then take the money that way. It's also a way that they we call it an expansion of boundaries, but they will say, hey, we need money, you could just dance in this club one night. And then, well, you're already dancing, and this guy just wants, a hand job, and he'll pay you like $200 extra if you could do that. And then it slowly becomes more and more and more. So we call the strip clubs, they're like the minor leagues, right? It's like a gateway. So
it's like the first stepping stone into it.
Exactly.
Each successive thing is a small step up from the last thing, but like after a long time, it's a huge step from where you begun. Right,
and you didn't notice, right? Because along the way it was just little things, and then at the end you're like, how did I get here? So, that is the strip clubs are a huge issue for us, and they're kind of totally separate from social media. But I think you guys had a question about legalizing.
Yeah. How if someone was an immigrant and then became involved, or if they were brought in from another country to be involved? Because we were on a website, it was one of the government websites, and it was talking about the people most wanted for trafficking, and I saw a woman and a man on there from China, and I didn't know if they had brought people in or what. Also, I was surprised that a woman was involved, because I feel like pimps are usually male.
Yes, no, the traffickers are typically male. However, there are often females involved in the system, but there are the rare cases where the females are the boss, like the head, they are the trafficker. That does happen. It's very rare, but it does happen. So we have the majority of our victims in Portland and in Oregon are domestic. They're girls from here. But there are cases, we're seeing cases of Asian massage parlor and apartment prostitution rings where they're bringing women over from Asia, and then they basically have to work off their debt for being brought over here. And they often, keep their passports, they can't leave. Those women, that is very difficult to infiltrate because it's a language barrier, for one. 2, these girls are very afraid because we're not talking about small-time Portland gangs. We're talking about big, huge crime syndicates, right? So they're terrified to talk. But, those women, we would get them into services. Whether or not they would eventually be deported is not up to us. I wouldn't arrest somebody and send them to ICE or whatever, but if you're convicted of a crime, you generally are deported. Hopefully, if they were willing to be witnesses, then that wouldn't happen, obviously, because we would keep them here so that they could testify. And that is a big, huge, more difficult, complicated issue that we honestly don't deal with that often because the majority of our victims are local. Or at least from the West Coast.
Yeah. So if they're not picked up by social media and they're not driving down 82nd, and so if it's in a high school, so like one girl would get involved with a pimp, and then that girl would come to school and get other girls to be involved?
Yeah, so there's some recruiting in the schools like that. Sometimes they'll come to, there's different ways. They'll invite them to parties. And then at the party, sometimes girls will be sexually assaulted. Sometimes they'll just meet a guy who's, pretends to be their boyfriend eventually. Or a girl who's actually already working will go into school and, her friends will be like, how are you making this? She'll have nice new things that the trafficker will buy her. And in the beginning, and how are you making all this money? And she'll tell them, and then, it's that slow expansion of boundaries again, right? So those are the ways that they're doing the schools. We rarely, but sometimes see that high school students are trafficking other high school students. That does happen. But that's usually a boyfriend-girlfriend type of thing as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is true, but I heard that at Clackamas Town Center and Lloyd Center, a lot of people lurk outside of the movie theaters and try and get girls that way.
Yeah, I mean, they basically, traffickers will go anywhere that there are young girls, and they will try and meet them. I mean, they'll give them compliments and try and get them to go on a date with them, and and then it just goes from there. And buy them stuff, take them out to dinner, get their hair done, get their nails done, and then it just kind of snowballs from there. And then she's her boyfriend, and he meets your family, and he goes to church with your family on Sunday. And then, we had a victim who came from a really good family. She went to Christian school. She went to Christian college. She worked for a Christian company. Her parents were still married. She had a totally stable childhood. And this guy she met on Plenty of Fish, because she was just looking for a date. She was like 22. And met her on there, met her family, promised that they were going to get married and have kids and have, the white picket fence, and went to church with her family. And this is the way they were going to get the money so they could have that life. Right? So it was all psychological manipulation. And these guys are chameleons. We think of them as like horrible people who, are just picking up girls and dragging them into cars and tying them up and beating them up, and and that's generally not how it's happening, right?
Yeah.
These guys are extremely charming, and they can talk to anybody and anything. So yeah, it's happening a lot at the malls. They're meeting girls there. We have one pimp who told us that he'd go around the mall and he'd look for a young girl by herself. And he'd go up to her and say, hey, you have beautiful eyes. And if she looked at him in the eyes and said, thank you, then he would move on. But if she looked down at the ground and said, no, I don't, then he had her. Right? So they're looking for girls with low self-esteem, a lack of self-worth, who are struggling in their life, and they're looking for something to fill some kind of void in their life. And they seize upon that, and they exploit it. And that's what they do.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
I'm stunned. That is awful.
It is awful because honestly, I find that it's much more traumatizing to have somebody psychologically manipulate you into believing that they love you instead of your typical gorilla pimp who he doesn't like you. He's just beating you up and making you do this.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. I think it's more difficult to get the finesse pimp victims away because they're totally brainwashed, basically.
Oh my gosh. Okay, well, thank you so much for this. It's very helpful.
No problem. I think you do have a question, though, I saw on if prostitution was legalized.
Oh, yeah.
Is that correct?
Okay. Yeah. How would that...
Are you curious about that?
Yeah, I totally forgot about that one, actually.
Okay.
If prostitution was legalized, how would the rate of human trafficking be changed? Like, would it fluctuate, or do you think it would just make it worse?
So, they have that, they call it the Nordic model. It's some of the Northern European countries have legalized prostitution. However, they have criminalized the buying, right? So basically makes it that the girls are not committing a crime, but the buyers are. That's the Nordic model. And a lot of people argue that we should have that here, so that because the girls aren't criminals. And we agree the girls aren't criminal. I mean, technically they're committing a crime. We don't see them as criminals. However, by decriminalizing, what Northern Europe does not have that America has is a pimp culture, right? So while they may have traffickers, American society glorifies pimping, right? Pimp my ride, pimp my phone, right? I'm a pimp. Songs about pimps win Grammys, right? They have movies, all that stuff. So, we romanticize and glamorize the life, and they don't have the same culture there. So we feel that it could be very dangerous to legalize, in the sense that you're making it easier. It may be easier for traffickers to convince girls to do it because it's not illegal anymore. At the same time, it would make it very difficult for us to find the girls.
Yeah.
Because it's not illegal anymore, right? I mean, we could still arrest the buyers, but to find the girls right now, we set them up in a sting, and we can detain them because they've committed a crime, and then during their detention, we can try and get them to get help, right?
Yeah.
If we didn't have that, then we would never find them. So it would really decrease the number of girls that could be saved from the life, I think. But also, they talk about places like the Bunny Ranch and the Mustang Ranch, and how specific areas of Nevada have legalized prostitution. It's regulated within legal brothels. I personally find issue with that, in the sense that they may not have a person trafficker, but the state has become their trafficker. Most of these women are, even if it's legal, are not in prostitution because they think it's a great career, right?
Yeah.
Most of them are in there because they feel like they have no other option. We call it the illusion of choice, right? So maybe they technically chose to do it, but why did they choose that? Were they abused as children? Are they drug addicts? Do they have no life skills and they have to feed their children? Is that really a choice, right? I mean, a choice to me is if you have other options and you still choose this. If you have no options, then is that really a choice? Yeah. We also see that, at like the Bunny Ranch and the Mustang Ranch and places like that, these girls, they get their money for their sex acts. They have to give half of it to the house. Then they have to pay for their medical testing. They have to pay for their room and board. Any gifts or any extras they get from the clients, half of that has to go to the house. So they basically just have a pimp in the house. I mean, it's just, the establishment itself is their pimp. And then we're also finding that a lot of these girls have actual traffickers in addition, who will make them go work there because it's legal.
Yeah.
So then they give half of whatever they make to the establishment, and then they give the other half to the pimp. So it's not really. And then it's interesting that you asked this question, because I read an article lately I found very interesting. It was by a college, and they did a study of buyers, and they asked the question, if we look at prostitution as labor, then it should be regulated like all other labor. But if we look at it as a form of sex abuse, then it should be outlawed, right?
Yeah.
And they found they asked like several hundred Johns, and they asked them all these questions, and the Johns scored and then they asked men who don't buy sex the same questions, and the men who bought sex scored much higher on sexual aggression, aggressive masculinity, lack of empathy towards females, and they seemed, through the questioning, more likely to commit sexual violence apart from there. So if you're looking at it as labor, if the people who are buying it are more likely to commit sexual violence, then it seems to me like more of a issue of some kind of sex abuse. Because in no other in no other world would it be okay to purchase a human being, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we all know that. But because they're women, and prostitutes are generally considered not even women, right? They're separate from real women or other women.
Yeah.
Then they're not as important, and we don't have to care about that. So I think that the question of legalization is kind of almost a moot point if you look at it like all these women in some way are being abused.
Yeah.
Right? And you wouldn't allow that in any kind of other labor industry. Right? So I don't know if that answers your question. That's just my opinion.
It
but
does. Thank you.